ready to go. Good morning, Warren. And we're going to turn it
Good
right
morning.
over to you. And Warren's the director of the library there at the George H.W. Bush Library. And we're really excited to have you, Warren. And I'm going to turn the program over to you. We're going to go straight on to the next session. Thank you so much for joining us. We really do appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me?
Yep.
Good. So we're going to do a little lighthearted approach, and again, maybe catch up and get you to lunch. First of all, would be remiss if I didn't talk about a little bit about the collection here. So 43 million pages of presidential and vice presidential records. We're unique in presidential libraries in that we have two collections of vice presidential records. We have 8 years of Bush VP, and we have 4 years of Dan Quayle, and we have, of course, the 4 years of presidential records. And then about 1 million photographs in this collection, all 35 millimeter Kodak color negatives. So we are a pre-digital library. And then about 10,000 video cassettes of almost everything George Bush did as president on a daily basis. Those are all in format called beta. For those who are old like me, you remember there were two competing formats. There was beta and there was VHS. A VHS tape was a little bit lower quality, but was longer because less data was on the tape, which is what made it lower quality. But beta was a little bit denser quality, so it was the standard that broadcasters used. So in the old days, beta was the standard for a quality tape. So we have about 10,000 of those. And then we also have, in addition to the presidential, vice presidential stuff, we have a wealth of personal materials, some of which I'm going to show you today. And then we have education materials. We have a website, bush41.org, and we have a lot of education materials there, something called Premier Program, which are tailored education lesson plans, and I invite you to go to bush41.org and see what we have there. So I want to talk a little bit about this relationship of George and Barbara Bush. 73 years of marriage. My colleague from the Carter Library, the only other longest marriage between a president and first lady are the Carters, and every day they increase the length of that marriage. But President and Mrs. Bush had 73 years of married life. So Mrs. Bush met President Bush. She was going to a girls' school in South Carolina. Her father was from Rye, New York. He published two women's magazines that were very popular at the time, Red Book and McCall's. So in the day, Red Book and McCall's were the Facebook and Twitter for women. Probably two of the most highly subscribed magazines in the US. And Mrs. Bush's family was wealthy, and she went to a girls' school in South Carolina called Ashley Hall. And President Bush, his father, worked for Brown Brothers Harriman. He was also wealthy, and he went to Phillips Andover Academy. So Mrs. Bush was home for Christmas, and she was 16 years old, and there was a Christmas dance. She says there was a kind of a Christmas dance. And this kid, so she's 16, the 17-year-old boy from Phillips comes to Rye to the Christmas dance. And he sees Mrs. Bush across the room. And he says to a friend of his, "Who's that girl?" And he says, "Well, that's Barbara Pierce." And he says, "Do you mind would you introduce us?" And a lot of our students work for us. She would have had this little thing attached to her wrist. It's called a dance card. We show these to our students, and they're just blown away. They can't understand what a dance card is. Anyway, So President Bush walks across the floor with his friend, and Mrs. Bush, as she says, was dancing with someone. I don't remember who. And this handsome young man walks up to her and he says, "Can we dance?" And Mrs. Bush says, "Yes." And then a waltz starts. And President Bush says, "You know, I don't waltz. I don't know how to waltz. Do you mind if we sit down and talk?" Now, President Bush went to Greenwich Day School and he was at Phillips Andover. He certainly knew how to waltz. But President Bush's sweet spot, his forte, was conversation, and he knew he was good at it. And so he and Mrs. Bush sat down and started talking. And Mrs. Bush says, we interviewed them both separately. Mrs. Bush says, "You know, I don't know if it's what love at first sight is, but that's what it was." And President Bush said the same thing. They were smitten. And immediately, love at first sight, 16 and 17. He was a handsome guy. He thought she was a beautiful girl, and he liked her and she liked him, and it cemented. So I have a letter that she wrote him shortly after the dance. It's actually, I've got a picture first. I'll show you a picture of them at a little bit after the dance. Trace, if you can show that picture. I think, yep. So he's a handsome guy. And it's funny. See how she's looking at him? This is always how she looked at him. Even when she was much, much older, she always looked at him just like that. Even when she was in her 80s, she just would stare at him just like that. So, and then shortly after, he invited her to a dance, and he wrote her a letter, and it starts off, "Dear Poppy." If you can pull that up, that would be great, because she loved this letter. It's 2.41. Thank you. "Dear Poppy." So George Bush was known as Poppy. Anybody who knew him before he went into the military knew him as Poppy. He was Poppy Bush. And she called him Poppy Bush up until almost the time she died. She loved this letter. You see it's on Ashley Hall stationery. "Dear Poppy, I think it was perfectly swell of you to invite me to dance, and I would love to come or go or whatever you say." So she would come into the museum and she would read this letter and she would start giggling. And she would say, "Who says swell?" Anyway, she loved this letter, but gives you a sense of you know, the love at first sight, and how devoted they were to each other. They were secretly engaged, although I'm not sure how secretly engaged they were, because it was pretty much an open secret that they were engaged for about 18 months. He was going to Phillips Andover, as I said, and he Pearl Harbor happened. He was at the age of 17. He tried to enlist. They wouldn't let him enlist. The Secretary of War was the commencement speaker at Andover the year he graduated. And just side story, Poppy Bush was big man on campus at Andover. He had gone to school a year early because his older brother had gone to school and he was home alone. So his parents had sent him to school a year early. And when he got to Andover, he got a staph infection. And in those days, there was no antibiotics. So George Bush had to take off almost an entire year of school, almost died. So he went from being the youngest kid in his class to one of the older kids in his class, was captain of the baseball team, captain of the soccer team. And there's a great story, if I might indulge. He was 17. There was a student named Bruce Gelb who was 13 at the time, and he was a freshman. and there were two upperclassmen forcing Bruce Gelb to carry an overstuffed chair across campus. He was being hazed. And George Bush went up to him, the two students, and said, "What are you doing? Leave the kid alone." And took the chair, and he and Bruce Gelb carried the chair back where it came from. And Bruce Gelb said in an interview, "There weren't too many 13-year-olds that had a hero, but when I was 13, my hero was Poppy Bush." So anyway, George Bush graduates from high school. The Secretary of War tells them they should all wait, go to college, and then the war will still be around. And Bush was accepted into the class of 1941 at Yale University, and he decides that's not what he's going to do. So he goes and enlists in the Navy as a Navy airman. And we believe it may be either the youngest or second youngest pilot to earn his wings during World War II. He flies off a ship called the San Jacinto, which was built with war bonds here in Texas. He names his Bush. He has three planes. One in training as the Barber 1. Then he has a plane that he has to ditch into the sea, the Barber 2. And then the third plane he has is the Barber 3. It's the one he was shot down off of Chichi Jima and almost lost his life. The two crewmen that were with him both died. And one of the reasons that President Bush did the parachute jumps on his 70th, 80th, 85th, 90th birthdays, and whenever else he could do a parachute jump, is because he had done the parachute jump. He had bailed out of his plane wrong. He'd made a mistake. He had opened the canopy, ordered the two crewmen that were with him to bail out, but he had opened the canopy and he had pulled the chute too quickly, and the chute caught the back of the plane. He hit his head on the rudder, knocked himself out, cut a hole in the panel, and ended up in the sea. If he had been captured, he probably would have been executed, because several of the soldiers that were captured on the island were executed, and the commander of the island he was bombing, Chichijima, was executed at the end of the war. But anyway, he wrote all these letters home to his mom and dad. We have 3 boxes of them. He's a great letter writer, as you know. We're certain that he wrote home letters to Barbara Bush, but they don't exist. Mrs. Bush said they were lost on a move. I think she probably didn't lose them in a move, but decided that for historic purposes, it was better maybe that they didn't show up at the Bush Library, so we don't know where they are. But anyway, the letter he writes after he's shot down tells his mom and dad he's okay, he's on a submarine, and writes them back to please tell Barbara that he's okay. So they had planned to get married on, I think, mid-December 1944, but he couldn't get home. And one of my favorite things here in the Bush Library is the wedding invitation. His brother got married on Prescott, his older brother got married New Year's Eve, and President Bush got married a week later, but because he couldn't make his wedding in December, they sent the wedding invitations out with the date penciled in. So in the museum is a copy of the wedding invitation with the date penciled in. And there's this lovely photo of them together on their wedding photo, which is wedding photo number 3. So hopefully we can pull that up. There it is. Don't they look handsome? He's wearing his Navy uniform because he's still in the Navy. So about 2019, right before COVID, we got a call from husband and wife, and the wife said that her mother had always claimed that she had she and her husband, the woman's parents, her mother had always claimed that they had honeymooned with the Bushes at Sea Island, Georgia. And she said the deal with my mother was, there was the fact, a good story should never be confused with the truth. So we weren't sure. We always assumed my mother was making the story up and that she didn't actually honeymoon with the Bushes. but she said, we pulled this motion picture footage out. And in fact, there's mom and dad with the Bushes. So we have honeymoon, Bush honeymoon footage edit, and it's the Bushes on their honeymoon. The bar. Oh, here it goes. So it was cold. Of course, they were married January the 6th, even though they're out on the Sea Islands, it was freezing cold. Mrs. Bush often talked about how cold it was. So this is the family. The husband was born with something wrong with his foot, so he actually did not serve, but that's the mother there. Of course, they're clowning around like newlyweds do. It's just nice, and that you just see how young they are. For the most part, we know the Bushes from their later years as they got older, but it's hard to imagine at one point they were kids. So he's what, 20 and she's 19. And I'm frankly surprised that George Bush is standing around because he was quite frenetic. Of course, everybody's smoking cigarettes. Not sure what they're playing bocce ball. I'm not quite sure what this is. See Mrs. Bush with the sweater on. Anyway, so after the honeymoon, he was enrolled in Yale class of 45. And of course, the war ended. He was still in service when they got married. The war ended. He was enrolled in Yale class of 45. And he got a couple years credit for being in the military. So he finished in 2.5 years. But he was the captain of the baseball team. Quite a fielder. He was a left-hander. He's about 6'1". He had there she is. She's not happy about this. She doesn't like being filmed. He was a left-hander, had about a 9.90 fielding average, which for a baseball player is pretty doggone good. And actually was scouted by the pros, but unfortunately his batting average, which he often argued with us about, was close to the Mendoza line. For those of you who are baseball fans, you know it's not very good. And she gave him there's a great picture there. It's 2694. A great picture of she was the official scorekeeper of the team, and she gave him an error in the Cornell game. And because he had such a high fielding average, that error in the Cornell game was a bit of a sore spot for the two of them. So many years later, they did a promo video for the Houston Astros, and if you can play Bushes Unplugged Astros clip number 6, and they talk about the error that she gave him in the Cornell game.
The President and Mrs. Bush.
You know, Barbara and I have always been baseball fans. In fact, I played first base for Yale and was captain of the team in 1948.
And I was the official scorer of that same team.
I still can't believe you gave me an error in the Cornell game.
That was a playable ball,
Was
George.
was not.
Jeff Bagwell would have had it.
For season tickets, call 799-9567.
What are you doing this summer?
It was a bad hop.
He's a great actor. of course, presidential candidate, but a great actor. Anyway, so they moved out to, we'll kind of hurry it up a little bit. They moved out to Midland, Odessa. Just married. He decides he wants to go out on his own. He's got a family friend out there named Neil Mallon, who Neil Bush is named after. And he decides to go out to Midland, Odessa instead of going into business at his father's place of business, to go into the, as we say here in Texas, the oil business. And the first house they live in is, we call it here, back home where I'm from, Alabama, we would call it a shotgun house. It's where you shoot in the front door and the pellets go out the back door. And they're sharing a bathroom with a mother and daughter team who seem to do most of their work at night. It's a mother-daughter prostitute team, and they're living in the other half of the house with them. And this is, Barbara Bush from Rye, New York. And she says, quite an eye opener. So they've had their first child, Georgie, at Yale. And so they're now making a family. And then real quick, I'd like to, if you can pull up number 5, book 16, the wishbone photo. We'll pull that up real quick, and then we'll move along. But this is their first Thanksgiving dinner. Mrs. Bush. So Mrs. Bush's granddaughter, Ellie LeBlond, wrote this book about their parents' love affair. And Mrs. Bush was an avid scrapbooker. We have about 100 of scrapbooks, beginning with the Yale years and running all the way through the presidency. And someone here at the library said, "Oh, well, Mrs. Bush, you didn't put those together yourself. You had somebody do it for you." And she was incensed, as only Mrs. Bush could be. That's her handwriting. And she said, no, I did those myself. So Ellie is going through the scrapbooks to find some pictures of her mom and dad and some of their story. And we had been through these scrapbooks, but had never found this. So inside this envelope, there is a wishbone, and it's broken. And it's the wishbone from her first turkey. And she's got, and this is always what Mrs. Bush, she has all the people that were at the dinner. And then Ned over here, he was supposed to come, but he got too sick. So she kept all that stuff. Anyway, so Midland, Odessa, began raising a family, gets into the oil business, gets into the oil rights business, and they have their first son, Georgie. Then they have their second child, daughter, Robin, and then their third child, Jeb. And shortly after Jeb is born, their daughter, Robin, comes down with leukemia and dies shortly after. And then it was shortly after this that Mrs. Bush turned gray. It was a huge tragedy, probably something that could be cured today, but at the time they took her to the Mayo Clinic, and they said it was just best to take her home and let her be at home. She's now buried here at the Presidential Library between them. And but it was a huge tragedy for them. So Middle Odessa, he forms an offshore subsidiary called Zapata Offshore with some partners who went on to buy this company called Pennsylvania Oil and form Pennzoil. But he forms this offshore subsidiary. He sinks some of the very first wells out in the Gulf of Mexico, does well, and decides to get into politics, and runs for the Senate with a glorious lack of success, as he says, in 1964. And in 1966 runs for the House. And 2 terms in the House, then runs for Senate again and loses again to a guy named Lloyd Benson, who was a Democrat here in Texas, but was a much more conservative Democrat than George Bush was as a Republican. And serves at the UN. And Mrs. Bush, he and Mrs. Bush had an apartment at the Waldorf Astoria, and they entertained and they enjoyed that. And then he goes to the RNC, which he doesn't enjoy. And he is there during Watergate, writes a letter to President Nixon telling him he's got to resign. And Nixon resigns. I'm not sure the letter did it, and then they go to China. And he's U.S. liaison to China. President Ford asked him, offers him several ambassadorships, France, England, several others, and President Bush decides he wants to go to China because it's brand new and it's exciting, and it's just opened up to the world. The ambassador is still in Taiwan, so he goes to Beijing and is the U.S. consul, not the ambassador, but the U.S. consul in Beijing. And this is Mrs. Bush's favorite job of anything he ever did, because it's just the two of them. And all the U.S. delegations that come to China, the business delegations, she and President Bush take them to the Forbidden City, and she loves it. And then a year later, he moves on to the CIA, and this is the job she doesn't like. And she falls into depression because they shared so much in China, and he comes from the CIA, and he can't share anything with her, and she feels left out, and she falls into depression, where she talks about it in her book. Then Carter becomes president. He begins running for president, as you know, as he says, out of a clear blue sky. President Bush or President Reagan names a VP, and they have a great time as the second couple. Then he runs for president, becomes president, and she is his partner, and advocates for literacy. And she thinks he's rather frumpy. So President Bush sends her to his designer, and we have all these gowns. She has all these gowns made for her, and those gowns we now have in the library. She's donated them all. She loved being first lady. The thing she said was she wanted to do something that helped other people every day. So she held an AIDS baby for the first time, hugged an AIDS patient. I one time made the mistake of saying that she was an advocate for children's literacy, and she corrected me. She said, no, I was an advocacy for family literacy, because if the parents could read, then the kids would learn how to read. So she was a huge advocate for literacy, and raised tons of money for literacy, and her organization, the Barbara Bush Foundation for Family Literacy, still raises money for literacy. And so the president for 4 years, they left office. Not too happy with Bill Clinton. President Bush had really liked him when he was governor. He was, I think, president at one point of the National Governors Association. And when Clinton left office, they rekindled this friendship. And President Bush used to call him Bubba. And he used to say that Bill Clinton was his brother by another mother. And they did great work together. They did hurricane relief, they did tsunami relief, and they did earthquake relief. And the two of them, two opponents, became fast friends. Mrs. Bush was took her much longer to warm up to Bill Clinton, but she said you couldn't help but like the guy. So they did a lot of that kind of stuff when they left office. I've got one more little piece of video that Bob Hope did one of his last specials right after the Bushes left office. And Bob Hope asked them to tape a segment for the show. And it was the jokes were horrible. And here's a small clip of President and Mrs. Bush trying to get through the taping.
He said Millie made over $1 million last year. It gives a whole new meaning to the phrase, good doggy.
That's not funny.
You got all the lines. Bob doesn't.
This isn't
Funny at all. I know it. Stop it.
all right.
Now, shh.
Okay, wait a minute.
That's funny.
All right, come on.
And not once did Bob step on any of my laugh lines.
That's good. Okay.
Yeah.
So anyway, their health was great for the first decade or more. Then their health started to decline, as you know. They were here a lot. They were here all the time. It was great having them here. As a director, it's just, fantastic to have a living former president and first lady that did a lot of programs here. She did a lot of literacy programs. They were both here all the time, but as their health failed, they came less and less and did less and less. So they were both hospitalized a lot in their final years. So Mrs. Bush had congestive heart failure, and she had already had a heart valve replaced a couple times. In fact, she had a pig valve, and at one of her literacy events, President Bush jokingly brought a pig out on stage and said it was her sister or brother or cousin. I'm not sure. Anyway, cutting up. So she went into the hospital. She was actually here not more than 2 or 3 months before she died. So she goes in the hospital for the very last time. President Bush's health was also not great towards the end of his life. In fact, frankly, we thought he would not outlive her, because we thought he was much, much worse shape than she was. He had a kind of vascular Parkinson's that progressed fairly rapidly. Went from walking on his own to walking with a cane to being on a scooter to in a wheelchair. Things just moved pretty rapidly for him. But she always seemed robust up until the end. So anyway, she's in the hospital for the final time, and as Jeb says, President Bush, he thought, was feeling lonely, so he decided he was sick too. So he goes to the hospital, and he says, President Bush goes down to see Barbara, and he's in a hospital gown, and his hair's all standing straight up, and he said he looks like a mess. Mrs. Bush opens her eyes and looks up at him, and she says, "George Bush, you are devilly handsome." So shortly after that, she passed away, and the funeral. We had her funeral and then his funeral, and I think he lived on because he wanted to go to Kennebunkport one last time, where he'd been every year of his life except for the year he was in the Pacific. And that last year he was at Kennebunkport, his staff asked him, said, "President Bush, we can stay here if you would like." And he said to him, "Are you asking me where I want to die?" And they said, "Well, yeah, kind of." And he says, "I want to go home. I want to die in Houston." So they flew back to Houston, and I think one of the last people to see him was his great friend, James Baker. He called him El Jefe, and he called him Bake. And they had some oysters, and he rubbed his feet, and Bush passed on. And you know the story of the great funeral. They were an amazing couple. He was, Meacham wrote his biography about President Bush. The working title was The Last Gentleman, and he decided to use a different title, but the title of the preface is The Last Gentleman, and he indeed was one of the very last gentlemen, or was indeed, I guess he's not the last gentleman, but he was indeed a gentleman. I was a brand new director in 2004. We were at a meeting with all of his friends, and I was sitting over a table all by myself because I was the new guy and nobody knew me. And he picked up his tray and walked over to my table where I was sitting by myself and sat down and ate lunch with me. I mean, that's just not the kind of stuff you do. And she was just great. I loved her, loved them both. I guess you're supposed to be dispassionate, but it's hard to do with them. The thing I really liked about her was if he walked into an exhibit and you asked him what he thought about it, he would say, "Oh, this is great." She walked into an exhibit one time when I was director, and I said, same exhibit he had said was great. I said, "Mrs. Bush, what do you think?" She said, "Well, it's not as good as the last one, is it, Warren?" And I said, "No, ma'am, it's not." But the great thing about that was you knew when Mrs. Bush liked it she was telling you the truth, and when she didn't, because when she didn't, she was going to tell you. So that's my spiel. I'm happy to answer any questions about anything, the collection, or George Barber Bush. But anyway, just want to do a little something a little lighthearted about their love affair.
Thank you, Warren. That was wonderful. Teachers, go ahead and put your questions in there. There's a lot of good comments coming in, but put your questions in there too, or if you'd like to unmute, you can do that too. We have a little bit of time for questions. But thanks again, Warren. That was really great. And wonderful resources too. The video of them cracking up was just really great.
Yeah, we play something called in our in a part of the library called Bushes Unplugged. And there's a whole reel of these comedy routines they did. She does one where she shortly after they left office, she walked into a restaurant where her son was having dinner when he was president, and the Secret Service actually wanded her because they didn't recognize her. So she did a very funny routine on that, and you know, they were big fans with Dana Carvey, good friends with Dana Carvey, and Dana Carvey, they did a segment with Dana Carvey where Dana Carvey calls up Mrs. Bush and says, you know, I'd like to do an imitation of President Bush, and she says, oh, I don't think George minds, and before she hands the phone to George Bush, and you can hear him say, no, I'm talking about your son, not the former president. And former president says, it goes through, does Dana Carvey doing George Bush? I like, it wouldn't be prudent, and it's, not at this juncture is good, but I say some other things too. And so he said, well, that's just great. That's great. But Hispanically, I think, anyway, he does this imitation of George W. So it's great stuff. Great stuff. They both had a great sense of humor. And he actually invited Dana, so he lost the election in November, and the staff at the White House was pretty down. So he invited Dana Carvey to the White House to cheer the staff up. And then Dana Carvey did a routine in the East Room, I think, which led to George Bush doing a couple of cold openings for Saturday Night Live.
Yeah, very good. Lots of good comments. And keep those comments coming. I wonder if anybody has specific questions about either the Bush presidency or either President Bush or Mrs. Bush. This is your opportunity. It's not too often you get a director of a presidential library on live with you. So if you've got the questions, please take the opportunity to do so.
And I'm also from the South, so I never let a good story conflict with the truth.
It struck me, Warren, there's a lot of parallels there with, and maybe it's a little too simplistic, but with the Bushes and the Trumans, there seems to be a lot of parallels there, I feel like, with both their relationship with the First Lady, but also the military experience as well.
So
it's interesting.
He was, it was and is the last president to serve in World War II. A lot like Truman was in the First World War. Anyway, so yeah, so there are a lot of parallels with Truman and the fact that both those two couples both were close, and also the Carters. He was director of Central Intelligence, a job that he did not want. There's a question here about the CIA. Yeah. He was director of Central Intelligence, a job he did not want. So he gets an offer to become director of Central Intelligence from Ford. The CIA is in terrible shape. For some of you who don't remember, the CIA, the Congress actually wanted to shut down the CIA because of some of the things they had done, and President Bush was asked to come back and become director of Central Intelligence, and he writes in his diary that it was the end of his political career, but that his dad always said, when the president asks you to do something, you have to come back and do it. So he comes back, he's director, and he testifies before Congress that intelligence is necessary, and the CIA shouldn't be shut down. And he learns while he's there how to use intelligence, and he rebuilds the esprit de corps at the CIA. And then about 20 years ago, they named now the George Bush Center for Central Intelligence, and there's a bust of him right there in the entryway. And every CIA officer I've talked to that was there when he was there just absolutely loves him, and the fact that he brought a new sense of honor back to the agency. And but also importantly, he learned how to use intelligence. Yeah, he was Tiananmen Square. Because he had been U.S. liaison in China, and he writes in his diary that his predecessor tells him that you should stay in the compound and you should not go out and meet the other ambassadors and the Chinese leadership. And he writes that's not how he operated. So he decides he's going to go out. He goes to all the National Day celebrations for all the other embassies, and meets with the junior Chinese leadership. And the junior Chinese leadership he meets with, he actually takes Chinese lessons, gets actually pretty proficient at Chinese. It's good enough, gets good enough at it so he can invite someone to lunch or to play tennis. That's how he operates, lunch and tennis. He's a small group guy. And but the point is that by the time he becomes president of the United States, these lower echelon Chinese leaders are now in the leadership of China. And he's not happy about Tiananmen Square, but believes that the relationship with China is important, and does some low-level, some personal correspondence back and forth between the U.S. and China. I would say that the best biography I've read is John Meacham's biography of George Bush. And then the other thing, the other book I would get, President Bush could not speak to a group of 5,000. Reagan could. President Bush was great in a group of 10, but he was also a fantastic letter writer. And he actually did a book of his letters, and they're fantastic. Some of them are funny, some of them are poignant, some of them are back and forth between him and Helmut Kohl. I would take a look at his book of letters, but the John Meacham biography probably is one of the best I've read so far, and he had extensive use of the president's personal diary. The relationship between Mrs. Bush and Mrs. Reagan strained. Mrs. Reagan had her own group of friends, and her priority was her husband. So anyway.
I think earlier on somebody asked about what would he consider, let me see if I got the right question, his greatest accomplishment.
So that's an interesting question. So he gets a lot of credit for his foreign policy, the Gulf War. He might consider the Gulf War probably the fact he was able to build his coalition, and he was very worried about the loss of life. He writes a letter to his children on the eve of the Gulf War, talking about how hard it is to send other people's children into war. But the fact that it was executed well, and there were American soldiers that were killed, but the fact that the early estimates were not true, maybe the Gulf War, but I don't think I think the one thing that here in the U.S. that probably will be his major accomplishment is the Americans with Disabilities Act. He doesn't get enough credit for his domestic accomplishments. Clean Air Act, he was all about the environment, a lot of environmental legislation, but the Americans with Disabilities Act. It's very funny. He's in a wheelchair. He's towards the end of his life, and he's being pushed to a restaurant, and they're having to use the cutouts in the sidewalks, and someone says to him, President Bush, it's because of you that these are here. Anyone who's traveled abroad knows that, we have a long way to go in this country as far as making people with disabilities, doing, better with the world around us here in this country. But if we do a much better job now than many other countries, you go to Britain and as well as they do, I don't know how someone in a wheelchair gets on the subway because, you hear Mind the Gap. Well, the reason you hear Mind the Gap is because the platform is not the same height as the subway cars. And here we seem to have been able to solve that. So I think the American Disabilities Act, maybe that one thing that lives on after him.
There's a question about whether he deliberately mispronounced Saddam Hussein's name.
I don't know. That's a good question. He undeliberately mispronounced a lot of things. He not a great speaker. One of the things, of course, Dana Carvey made fun of him all the time because he did mispronounce words, and so whether he mispronounced it on purpose or not, I'm not sure. Never did say. Never heard him say.
One more just popped in there.
So yeah, the '88 election. Yeah. I met President Reagan. I was in California after he left office, and I met President Reagan shortly after he left office. I was part of the archive team that helped set up the Reagan Library, and it would be hard to know if he had dementia at the time. It was only until later that it started to show up. So whether he had it when he was president, I couldn't speculate. No one seemed to think so.
Very good. Just pausing to see if we've got any last questions, last opportunity. Warren, I'd really like to thank you again. A wonderful presentation, great resources, and really want to thank you for spending your time with us this morning. Thanks so much.